The economy doesn't look good at all, and it will probably look even worse in the future. So the preconditions for a complete collapse are there, but I still don't see that happening within the next year at least. I want it to happen, of course. There's nothing that I would wish more than a complete disintegration of the Russian Federation at the moment, to be completely honest with you. In fact, if there's one thing that I would really love to do at the moment, it's to sit in an Independence Square in the city of Ufa, enjoying the view and drinking a cup of coffee.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series available on YouTube about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined for the first time on Frontline by Michael Gentile, Professor in Human Geography at the University of Oslo, who's been doing research on Ukraine for many years, including a recent publication about teachers, de-Ukrainianization and agitprop in Ukraine's occupied territories. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for hosting me.
First of all, I know you've recently returned from a trip to Ukraine. You were doing field work, including in Donetsk and Kharkiv oblasts. What are your key takeaways from your trip?
Well, over time, the atmosphere is changing. Not very much for the better, I'm afraid to say. I sense that the encroaching front line, it's moving very, very slowly, but it's very felt. And pessimism is spreading, despite the fact that things are actually not going that well for the Russians after all. And it's, of course, a very stressful life in Kharkiv and Donetsk Oblast. The closer you get to the front line, the more stressful it is. Just the fact that you have the ominous sounds of field artillery in the background accompanying your daily life is a moment of deep stress, I would say, for the local population. And, of course, the psychological impact of Russians having claimed annexation on the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts and Zaporizhia and Kherson and obviously Crimea is quite significant, even though the day-to-day lives of people living in Sumy, for example, or even in Kharkiv, are not very different than what things are like in Kramatorsk, for example, or in Slavyansk. The day-to-day risks of walking on the streets in Sumy are pretty much the same as in Kramatorsk, but the perception of threat is very different, and probably for a good reason.
And the perception is a really interesting thing because, I mean, you mentioned a moment ago, Michael, how actually things aren't great for Russia either, but there is this narrative that you pick up in parts of the media that, you know, Russia is winning this war, that things are very difficult for Ukraine. Now, listen, we all know things are difficult for Ukraine, but can you talk a little bit about the challenges facing Russia at the moment as well?
On the one hand, there's the Russian classic narrative of invincibility. That's what they want us to believe. On the other hand, Russia is facing a lot of challenges at the moment. There are economic challenges, ruble down, inflation up. Production of military hardware can't keep up with the rate of consumption. Of course, it can be replaced with Chinese and North Korean and Iranian help, but nevertheless, Russia is not self-sufficient in fighting this war. And they are not advancing as fast as they were hoping to advance, obviously. I cannot even recall how long they've been knocking on Chasiv Yar's doors, and only now have they managed to partly occupy the city. Tarietsk also is a city that is a very important target for them, and they've been trying to occupy. They declared full occupation recently of Tarietsk, but as far as I understand, that's not a completely finished affair. And of course, if they do succeed with controlling those two cities, then the door to the northern Donetsk Oblast agglomeration might be opened a little bit more. But even then, I have my doubts. Konstantinivka is, of course, or Kostiantynivka, as it's called in Ukrainian, is, of course, more directly threatened, also because of the topography. But already the next town, Drushkivka, is on a hill. And then we have Kramatorsk, partly also on a hill, and so forth. Of course, pressure comes from the north as well, from the Liman direction, and also from further southwest. But they're not advancing particularly fast in any way. And not to mention the fact that Ukrainians are counter-striking quite beautifully on Russian territory.
Well, indeed, and we've seen renewed offensive operations in Kursk in recent weeks. I suppose the big question for 2025, Michael, when it comes to the war in Ukraine is, can Donald Trump achieve some kind of peace deal? He has said in the last 24 hours that he believes he's making progress towards bringing peace to Ukraine. How do you rate his chances of actually doing that?
More than zero. But I'm not exactly sure quite how much more than zero, but I do not think that there is a genuine chance that Trump can succeed in obtaining peace. Maybe a ceasefire, which will most likely not be respected, but peace is actually, as I see it, quite far away. Mainly because there's no reason for Vladimir Putin to actually agree to a peace deal along the lines that Keith Kellogg and Donald Trump seem to have been proposing. For starters, Russia claims to have annexed all of Donetsk Oblast, all of Luhansk Oblast, Zaporizhia not to mention, and Kherson. And I don't see how they would back off from claims to the regional capital of Zaporizhia Oblast, or Kherson Oblast, for example, not to mention the northern Donetsk Oblast agglomeration. I just don't see how freezing the current front line would be an option for the Russians unless they are compelled to do so, which would mean that support in terms of military hardware to Ukraine would have to be beefed up significantly.
And you think also, this idea of a demilitarized zone, say, between Russia and Ukraine is infeasible because presumably you would need Western troops policing it, and that is a non-starter if you're Putin.
Not only Western troops policing them, but a lot of Western troops policing them. And I can imagine that Putin could agree on something to the effect of, let's have some joint policing mission. I mean, that wouldn't be the first time. But what would that actually imply in reality? That would imply that it's a demilitarized zone that Russia controls, pretty much militarily. So this is not something that I really see as an option at the moment. And it's very premature to even talk about that, to be honest.
Well, so I suppose that the next question is, if we're thinking that it is unlikely that Trump will achieve some kind of lasting peace in the next 12 months or so, what will America's approach to Ukraine be? Will it sell out the Ukrainians, or might it even double down on its support for Ukraine? And I wanted to ask you about comments we've had in the last week or so from Donald Trump about what America wants to see from Ukraine, and specifically access to rare earth minerals. We know that there's a lot of lithium, for example, and other resources in Ukraine. If Trump said, look, we can help you recapture some of the territory that Russia currently occupies in exchange for us getting a massive slice of your natural resources, okay, you might say that is America exploiting Ukraine in its hour of need to plunder its natural resources, but that might drive Vladimir Putin out of Ukraine, might it not?
That would be a very positive scenario indeed. And we have to keep in mind, first of all, that the deposits of rare metals that the US is interested in at the moment, and particularly lithium deposits, are partly located under occupation in Donetsk Oblast, and partly not under occupation, but relatively threatened by future occupation anyway in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Still not too close to the front line, but not too far either, and in a position that seems somewhat fragile. So the question here is, which resources does Donald Trump actually want to get his hands on? Is he satisfied with less than 50% of them? In that case, there's no way it'll be possible to convince him to push into Donetsk Oblast, or does he want the whole thing? It's very, very difficult for me to even imagine what he might be thinking and whether he even knows where these deposits are located. Hopefully he does, of course. But this would indeed be a way for Zelensky to work in the future. I'm not convinced it is likely that Putin would agree to anything that would involve giving up control over Donetsk Oblast, or even parts of Donetsk Oblast, not to mention the fact that these deposits are located relatively deep into the non-government controlled area of Donetsk Oblast. They're not right at the front line, but they're a little bit further away. So that means redrawing the map of territorial control quite significantly. Now, to return to the issue of what Donald Trump actually wants in Ukraine, he says he wants peace and he wants the killing to finish as soon as possible. But this is, again, the same man that threatens Canada, Greenland, South Africa recently, claims that he wants to basically make a real estate deal in the Gaza Strip and so forth. So I take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. But what he does want is credit for being the man who created peace in Ukraine. That, I'm sure, is one of his many ego-related targets. As you can hear, I'm not particularly optimistic about the 47th president. But I think that is one of his main motivating forces. It's his ego. And then he needs arguments that will allow him to pursue this ego motivation. And the rare metals could be one of the channels through which this could be pursued.
And by the sounds of it, he's already being given some assurances around it. I mean, he's quoted as saying, he gave an interview to Fox News only yesterday. He said, and I quote, "I told them I want the equivalent of $500 billion of rare earth, and they've essentially agreed to do that. At least we don't feel stupid." And Volodymyr Zelensky, indeed, has come out and said, I think he said last week, the Americans help the most, and therefore the Americans should earn the most. I mean, Zelensky's role in this is really interesting. I mean, I don't know if you agree with this, Michael. We've seen since the US election, I think, Zelensky's skills as a politician really come to the fore. You know, I think most people would be safe to assume that Zelensky would have rather had Harris in the White House, but he's really pivoted cleverly, I think, to dealing with Trump.
I completely agree, and he understands Trump's ego personality on the one hand, his narcissism, and his belief in transactional agreements. And he's playing those two cards absolutely beautifully. I mean, Zelensky's first prime task now is, of course, to preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. And that comes before anything else. If it's worth $500 billion in rare metals, so be it. But of course, I have no idea whether the $500 billion of rare metals are actually sufficiently found in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. It could be that there's enough there. That I don't know. But the fact is that something like 53% of the deposits lie in Donetsk Oblast, not 53%, but I'm sorry, in occupied territories. That's how we should put it, because there's bits and pieces of resources spread about elsewhere in Ukraine too, but nothing like the amount of stuff that you'll find in Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. But I completely agree with your assessment. Zelensky is playing his cards as best he can, but he has a pretty poor hand at the moment. Of course, this is his possibly his strongest hand. And I presume that Elon Musk has a little bit of a role here to play as well. But on the other hand, Elon Musk, not to mention the vice president, have shown little interest in the fate of Ukraine as such. Now, the other issue that came to my mind is that because the rare metals are also found on the non-government controlled side, Trump could easily be using the same card with the Russians. Why not cut a so-called deal that, we won't send Ukraine any more weapons, but you give us your metals that are in Donetsk Oblast. Plus that the Russians have a lot of other stuff too. I mean, they elsewhere in the country. That thought crossed my mind, but it would be quite a political move to go in that direction, and a complete break with the Allies.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. And how do you think Michael Vladimir Putin will be approaching the second Trump presidency? Donald Trump has said they spoke recently. We don't know whether that was before his second inauguration or after, but clearly there is communication there. They've got a long and complicated history. How do you think Putin is thinking about Trump this time around?
Well, he was disappointed last time, that's for sure. But this time, Trump has moved much more in a direction that is appealing for Putin. It was already clear that this was going to be the case before. And everything that he's been doing so far is very much in line with Putin's strategic goals. First and foremost, the continued and very deep going polarization of American society, which preferably should also stretch to a polarization between US foreign policy and the interests of Western or NATO allied countries. So in that sense, I think that Putin will just wait and see what happens and will try to play Trump's ego just the same way that Zelensky is trying to do. And he too is skilled in that respect. I mean, he has his background in intelligence agencies. That doesn't hurt. To be honest, I'm afraid that Putin will simply play Trump.
You think even though Donald Trump has this reputation, or certainly likes to foster this reputation of being a deal maker and the man who comes out on top in negotiations, you still fear that it will be Putin who gets the better of Trump?
I mean, the important thing for Trump is to sell whatever deal he has as a great victory. And by the way, that's the same important spot for Putin. He wants to sell whatever deal he gets as a victory. And the problem, of course, is that so Putin had two goals that he claimed motivated his invasion of Ukraine. Denazification, which means de-Ukrainianization and Russification, and demilitarization, which means to subjugate Ukraine, to get rid of any sovereignty it has. That's its two general goals, which means that in turn, what he will want at some point is his man in Kyiv. So he wants control of Kyiv. And that connects to all of the historical or pseudo-historical narratives of Russia and Ukraine being a single unity and being historically linked for 1,000 years and so forth. He wants recognition as a great power, and Trump will be happy to give it to him. He's already given him that kind of recognition in the past by saying, what a great leader he is, and that he's a great friend of his, and that they get along great. I mean, he's getting close to that. He will want to avoid all threats to his regime. That's probably even the most important criterion for the moment. Make sure that he and his lackeys stay in power. He will want to get rid of sanctions, and I can imagine Trump cutting some kind of deal that will reduce them, even though he's talking about increasing them at the moment. He will want to have as much land as possible with as little effort as possible. In other words, he will want to try to cut a deal where he gets Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia Oblast, all of them for free. In other words, that the Ukrainian troops would be retreating without putting up a fight. And that I don't see happening. And I don't see how the Americans could force that upon the Ukrainians, except by completely ending all military aid. And that would also have to be, the European countries would have to follow suit for that to be a successful strategy from the Russian perspective. And he will want recognition of these annexations, not just de facto control, but actually international recognition. But then that raises another issue, because assume the Russians got control over Zaporizhia, which is a really big city. It's got its huge steelworks, hydroelectrical power generation facilities, the Dnipro power plant, which, by the way, has been struck by missiles a few times without being destroyed. It's a solid structure, built with the know-how of American engineers back in the 30s, as a matter of fact. But then what you do with Dnipro, the nearby city, which is the fortress of Ukrainian military technology know-how. And not to mention, it's a city that's very strongly functionally interlinked with Zaporizhia and with Kryvyi Rih, the nearby city that has these gigantic iron ore mines. Those three cities together and their surrounding regions are a single economic entity, you could say. And drawing a hard boundary between Zaporizhia and Dnipro just seems very, very unlikely to me, unless you've got your man in Kyiv. And then I also suspect that he would really love to have Odessa and Kharkiv in some way too.
But I mean, that's a long old, almost shopping list of demands that Vladimir Putin wants, and he's not going to get all that, Michael. So surely,
Of course not.
surely the key question is, well, is that just a negotiating position? Is that just what he will say publicly and say at his first, if there are peace talks, at the first peace talks, and then is prepared to jettison some of those demands and compromise on some of them? Or do you think Vladimir Putin actually believes he can get that, and if he's determined to try and keep demanding that, does he not risk aggravating Donald Trump, who, Keith Kellogg has previously suggested if Putin does not make serious concessions, we will arm Ukraine to the teeth?
Yes, I mean, all of that depends on the situation on the ground, of course. A Russia that is advancing will want to demand and receive more than a Russia that is pushed back. So exactly how hard those demands are really depends on the ground level situation. So at the moment, of course, he won't get that stuff. But at the same time, how much, by having an unrealistic amount of demands, how many additional demands can he get fulfilled by Donald Trump's administration, which he shouldn't get? You see what I mean? So he won't get control over all of Ukraine, but we have to still keep in mind what was his ultimatum about in December 2021, which was pretty much, to translate it in simple terms, give us back all of Central and Eastern Europe, or at least most of it. That was his first demand. So now the demands are probably scaled down quite significantly, but Kyiv is really, really important for him. So he'll want something more than just those territories, is my guess. And I hope the answer from Ukraine, it'll be obviously a no, but from allies and from the United States in particular, will be forget it. I don't know.
It's interesting you mentioned the pretense of denazification that Russia used as part of its justification for going into Ukraine. And I know that you've written quite a lot about the kind of de-Ukrainianization of parts of occupied Ukraine. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the tactics that Russia have been using over the past 2 or 3 years in occupied Ukraine, Michael?
Yeah, so the tactics, first of all, have differed somewhat depending on what seems to have been the goal of the occupation. So my impression from the very beginning was that the tactics were very, very different in the north as opposed to the south. In the north, it was very much smash and grab, literally. I mean, they were stealing washing machines and toilets and killing people in the process. Whereas in the south, they seemed to try to establish a more permanent type of occupation, trying to identify specific threats to their occupation regime, annihilating them, killing them, imprisoning them, or whatever, but without resorting to mass terror, because you do want to keep the hearts and minds of the people with you, which is definitely not an easy thing to do in Ukraine. Because one thing that Putin misunderstood is that he thought wanting to be with Russia, which was something that many people in southern and eastern Ukraine wanted, was the same thing as wanting to be in Russia. That's a big difference. And when the Russians come to your door and do all sorts of stuff that you never imagined they could have ever done, you not only do you not want to be in Russia, but you don't want to be with Russia either. So the task was a very, very difficult one. And of course, if we look at the results, when the Russians attacked or besieged Mariupol, how many people are actually left? Well, of course, many lost their homes, but something like a quarter of the population actually stayed put. Everyone else tried to flee in whatever direction possible, but mainly towards the government-controlled parts of Ukraine. Some were, of course, kidnapped, children in particular, to Russia. Many, many people were killed. But generally speaking, that people voted with their feet to the extent that it was possible. Now, returning to the actual annexation and indoctrination strategies, what we've seen in the south is very much a condensed version of what was done in the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, particularly starting from 2019. It was in 2019 that the idea of the People's Republics as independent states more or less faded away. And that was when Russian flags really became ubiquitous in the Donetsk and Luhansk occupied regions. You could easily say that the idea of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics actually never made sense from the beginning. And I actually have interviewed some former quite high-placed Donetsk Republic people. They just told me, we never wanted to be a Donetsk Republic. We just wanted to be part of Russia. I mean, they were very explicit about it. But in the meantime, at the very beginning, they did try to produce some kind of new Donbass identity. They even tried to invent the concept of Donbass cuisine in local restaurants, just to give you an idea. But the main channel of indoctrination was through schools. That was the main thing. You want to get a new generation that has forgotten about Ukraine. That's the most important thing. Not so much love Russia, but forget Ukraine. They're bad and they want to kill you, and they've been bombing you for up to 8 years. 2022, that's the main propaganda line of the Russians. We had to save these guys in the Donbass because they've been bombed for 8 years. That's almost become a meme, by the way, in Ukrainian circles. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, you change the school curriculum. But to give you an example, the Donetsk authorities were actually quite bad at that. So I picked up a geography ninth form school book published in Donetsk Republic some time ago. Or I didn't pick it up, I printed it out. I found it online. And the funny thing is that you see the first page and it says approved by the Ministry of whatever information or something of the Donetsk People's Republic. I can't remember which entity. And it starts off by claiming that, yeah, well, there's been things happening and now we've got the Donetsk People's Republic. Very cautious otherwise. And then the rest of the book is pretty much a Ukrainian book, including Crimea being presented as part of Ukraine. By mistake, which suggests, of course, that whoever was overseeing the publication process didn't do a very good job, because that really is a boundary you don't want to cross in that particular society. But nevertheless, that was in 2015, 2016. Already around 2017, things were changing a bit, but it was in 2019 that the big changes occurred. And nevertheless, even in the occupied territories, you'd find teachers, for example, who would secretly take their pupils, their classes, to libraries where they could consult Ukrainian books, which had otherwise been, they had vanished from schools. These teachers, some got caught, some eventually left, fled the scene. They went to the government-controlled areas. But nevertheless, there was that kind of resistance, particularly in the first few years. But over time, so-called patriotic education started taking over more and more. The so-called Yunarmia became a very visible element across the Donbass and Luhansk Oblast. And as to Zaporizhia and Kherson, frankly, I'm not sure. And I haven't seen any publications. I mean, what I do know is, for example, in Mariupol, massive indoctrination of school kids is taking place. And more or less following the lines of what you see in Russia proper, where it also all accelerated very rapidly during the past 3 years, since the beginning of what they call the special military operation.
And just finally, Michael, I wonder how you assess the strength or indeed the weakness of Vladimir Putin's regime. You mentioned a moment ago that the most important thing for him in any negotiations is to preserve the stability of his own regime. And yet we know that the Russian economy is in a difficult place. As you mentioned, the value of the ruble continues to fall and inflation continues to rise. Now they're relying on North Korean construction workers, according to South Korean sources, to fill labour shortages. And if Donald Trump does ramp up domestic oil production in the US, that may damage the global oil price and that may further damage the Russian economy. So I wonder how you assess the strength of Putin's regime at the moment.
Well, it's not a weak regime, because he has the whole security forces structures surrounding him and backing him up, as far as I understand so far. The economy doesn't look good at all, and it will probably look even worse in the future. So the preconditions for a complete collapse are there, but I still don't see that happening within the next year at least. I want it to happen, of course. There's nothing that I would wish more than a complete disintegration of the Russian Federation at the moment, to be completely honest with you. In fact, if there's one thing that I would really love to do at the moment, it's to sit in an Independence Square in the city of Ufa, enjoying the view and drinking a cup of coffee. But I'm afraid that's not coming up anytime soon. Summary is that I think he's still going to be around for a while. And like any autocrat, his goal is to preserve his own power. I mean, he's not unique in any way.
Michael, this has been a fascinating conversation. We really appreciate your insight and your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.